I like it.
All right, everybody. We are live officially on the spawn session here that we're doing. Kenny's with me. I'm Russ with Oozlefinch. To my right here is Rachel Edwards. A lot of you may not know this, but she is our head brewer and blender at Oozlefinch. Yes, she's 25 years old barely, but absolutely making some rockin' beers and killing it for us here. So, yeah, this is her. She's going to take this panel from here. We're going to bring up the other guests and get started. If you have Q&A, please put it into the comment section, and we will get to it at the end of this session. So I'm going to let Rachel take it from here, and we'll bring everybody else on screen. Enjoy.
All right, there they are. Hey, everybody. Like Russ said, my name is Rachel. I'm the pretty new head brewer here at Oozlefinch, so I'm extremely excited to be here talking to all of these fine people. And I'll let them introduce themselves because they know themselves the best. If you want, James, you want to start? I'll have you start. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm James Howat. I own Black Project Spontaneous and Wild Ales in Denver, Colorado, and we focus on making beer with true wild and native yeast. A lot of it spontaneous, and some of it using further generations of unisolated, cool ship caught wild yeast.
Awesome. I'll go to you next, Paul, because you're beneath me. Underneath
Okay.
me.
Yeah, my name's Paul Arney. I own and operate the Ale Apothcracy here in Bend, Oregon. My goal is to brew as natural beer as we can with a sense of place, and so that incorporates the wild yeast, and then anything and everything we can find outside the brewery that will help improve or create interesting beer.
Yes, we love those wild bugs. And I'm going to finish off with Melinda.
Hey, I am Melinda I'm the founder of Morning Light Kombucha. We're a really small, I guess you'd call like a micro kombucha brewery here in Hoyt, Kansas. And so we work a lot with our local farmers here, as well as go out and forage for just some of our traditional foods that are close by, and just any kind of wild seasonal fruits and vegetables that are around here.
It's amazing. A lot of people ask me what's the difference between kombucha and some sour wild ales, and it's really fun to kind of explain the differences and the similarities between those two things. So we're very excited to have you on. First off, does everyone have a beer? Is everyone drinking a beverage today?
I'm actually drinking water right now. I'm on the West Coast. I got to work today.
Oh man.
It'll come soon enough.
Perfect. Yes. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of ask some questions, and I'm gonna let you guys kind of take it away. I don't want to assign certain questions to people, so if you're feeling super passionate about that subject, just go ahead and jump in and give us your thoughts. So first, can one of you explain the difference in spontaneous fermentation and mixed fermentation? And what are some different ways that you can create spontaneous fermentation?
Well, I'll just jump in and throw my, the little that I really know about this subject out there. I was at a panel in Italy. I think James might have been there. Listening to Pierre Tilquin talk about spontaneous beer, and I think it was at that moment that I realized that just that term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's like so for speaking for us here, I usually refer to our spontaneous beers. They're beers where we leave the wort out overnight, and then we will rack that wort into barrels the following day and wait for fermentation to start. And whether or not that yeast is coming from the barrels or from the air, I haven't done the research, but I guess I would consider those to be what we call our spontaneous beers. Generally, if we add fruit, it's also going to be bringing yeast in there. And so I know there's debate about whether or not that would be considered spontaneous or not. But for us, when we leave the wort out overnight, rack it into barrels and allow fermentation to start without pitching any yeast, that's what I call spontaneous. And that's probably makes up about a third of our overall production. The rest is a mixed culture that we keep in house. I'm trying to employ some techniques that the Scandinavian brewers use with kvike and drying yeast and all that. But with those beers, it's more of a alcoholic wild Saccharomyces primary ferment dominated, where we see with our spontaneous beers that tends to be Brettanomyces dominated. If that means anything to anybody, I mean, I'm happy to listen. But that's kind of what we see at our place.
Okay. You guys have any differences over at Black Project or Morning Light?
I mean, I agree with that pretty much. We kind of do it two different ways. About 50% of our production is traditional Belgian spontaneous, where we leave the wort out overnight to cool and then put it in barrels. Same sort of deal. We do our best to try and make sure that our barrels are as sterile as possible, but it's impossible to sterilize wood. So we like to think that the microbes are coming from the air, but there's obviously some influence there for the wood as well. And the other way we do it is we've taken barrels of that kind of beer years ago and then started them in a larger vessel and then essentially feed them constantly. We call it like a spontaneous solera, but I wouldn't call it spontaneous fermentation because we know we're adding work to beer essentially, and that's to me that's part of the spontaneous and wild ales is what we do. Those are wild ales, not spontaneous fermentation to us. So, as far as other ways to do it, we've done it a little bit with. We've done quite a few grape beers, and it's been interesting to essentially crop grapes and let them start fermenting on their own, which grapes do. If you don't mess it up with like adding sulfite and lab yeast and all these things. But we've done that and then added work to that process sort of at the peak of fermentation. So we're using the native yeast from the skins of the fruit, and you can use the other fruit also. Mostly, it works really well with grapes for sure. So we've done that as well. I don't know if that is spontaneous or not, or what Pierre would say about that, but to me, we haven't added yeast. And there's no doubt in my mind that a natural wine fermentation, if you're not adding work to it, you're just crushing grapes and they ferment on their own. To me, that's also a type of spontaneous fermentation. It's not usually what we talk about with beer, but I mean, it's hard to say you've added yeast or done anything if you haven't. So, yeah.
What about you, Melinda? What do you guys do with your kombucha?
So I honestly I'm not too familiar with spontaneous fermentation. It sounds like it's probably similar to what we're doing. I don't really, I've never brewed beer, so I'm not really familiar with how it all goes. And so, but ours is pretty simple. We're just starting with our tea and our sugar and our water, and then adding it to our starter liquid that already has existing bacteria and yeast in it, and kind of letting it ferment and do its thing. And eventually it'll kind of grow a little cellulose, little mat over the SCOBY and create its own little micro environment. So it kind of is able to kind of keep out any wild yeast and just anything that's kind of in the air. But initially it's exposed, if there's no SCOBY there. So I don't know, it's something I don't know how comparable. I mean, I don't add any extra yeast in or anything like that. So that's probably close to spontaneous, I guess.
Yeah.
So Melinda, do you get to a point where you're cleaning your SCOBYs? Like, are you your process where they grow and they get to a certain point, and then, do you get to a point where you're cutting them down or cleaning them or doing anything with them?
No, not really. Since we work so closely with farmers, we'll give them to their livestock, and do the different things. Like, we're just kind of after a while, we'll kind of remove a SCOBY and use it for our own, we'll do facials and just different things, but we'll repurpose it for another reason, whether it's going into the compost pile or going and feeding pigs in the community and things like that. So no, we don't. I mean, we don't get to a point where we need to be cleaning them all the time or anything like that. We just kind of let them grow, and we do a continuous brewing. So they're in there. We might remove them while we're adding a new brew into there, and then just replacing them. So that's kind of what we do.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I don't know a lot about kombucha, so I have a lot to learn from you as well. So we're going to go on to give our audience, a lot of them probably have some varying knowledge about what sour and wild cultures are like, and what kind of bugs you can find in these cultures. So if somebody's feeling like giving a quick science lesson about wild yeast and bacteria, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure, I can start on this. So we don't do a lot of like plating or isolation. People ask us all the time, like, hey, you make this sort of lambic style spontaneous beer, how do you know what's in there? It doesn't, to me, it doesn't really matter, because I want to make it with whatever is in there. And I like how it comes out. So to know, oh, it's got this strain or this strain. First of all, it's expensive and difficult to get a strain level identification. Or even a species level identification. Usually when people are doing stuff, it's just a genus, right? So you have Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but you can tell Saccharomyces, but you don't know if it's contamination of lab yeast from somebody in your brewery, or if it's a wild Saccharomyces. Anyway, but I guess the point is, we haven't tested it, but I think with spontaneous fermentation, there could be hundreds of species involved, and I think there's been testing that shows there may be at different points. But it's essentially, I think, for Brettanomyces, there's probably some wild Saccharomyces as part of it also. And then Lactobacillus species and Pediococcus, I think, are kind of the four ones that everybody talks about that pretty much make the beer. And so the last two are bacteria. Bacteria, I think that most Lactobacillus is inhibited in a traditional Belgian-style spontaneous fermentation. They tend to work quicker, but they're inhibited by alpha acids from hops. And so even using aged hops, you're inhibiting them, in my experience, quite strongly. And later in the process, Pediococcus, which is less inhibited, takes over. And so in our experience, we have an initial fermentation, and the beer is alcoholic, but not sour, and not really very good, but a month or so in, and then over 6 months or so after that, Brettanomyces and Pediococcus continue to work, and the Brett makes it cleaner and funkier, and the Pedio makes it more, it produces lactic acid, like lactic acid bacteria, but it's a little bit more hardy organism, and they work together to make the beer sour. So that's my
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with James as far as our approach here. It's thumbnail sketches are great, and one of the things I like about beer, or especially the type of beer brewing that we're trying to do is, one that doesn't need a brewer's catalog or a laboratory, right? I really like, the rule of thumb kind of thing, right? It's like if it feels right, and with experience, you start to recognize certain things or certain flavors. And, we do have a microscope, and we enjoy looking through it, and we can learn some things that way. And so the way that I've set up, I would call our mixed fermentation is to give each part of the process, kind of these organisms, it's their time to shine, shall we say. So like our primary fermentation is generally dominated by wild Saccharomyces, the yeast that consumes sugar and turns into alcohol and lots of good flavors. And mind you, there's still these other organisms that James was talking about in the fermentation. It's dominated by our wild Saccharomyces. And then once the beer goes into barrels, that tends to be this, the longest, slowest fermentation, where we see a lot of the bread activity, and at the end, some Pediococcus. But one thing that I have incorporated into our brewing, which in order to kind of go after this idea of brewing natural beer, is in making beer. There's points in the process where brewers want to adjust their pH a little bit, right? And so contemporary practice in industrial brew houses is you add mineral salts that will buffer and hold pHs at certain ranges where it favors, hop bitterness or enzyme production in your mash, enzyme activity in your mash, those kind of things. But in Germany, they've been dealing with this Reinheitsgebot rule for a very long time, which some say may have stymied certain bits of creativity. But the switch side of that is most breweries in Germany have what's called a Sauerwork production in their basement, and where they're grabbing wort from the lauter tun on the way to the kettle, and they've got the lactobacillus organism there that's souring the wort. And lactobacillus, for people who are unfamiliar with that, if you enjoy sourdough bread, or sauerkraut, that tang that you get in those foods are coming from lactobacillus turning sugars into acid. And so I have this puncheon with a heating element in it where we put wort and the lactobacillus sours the wort, and we're holding it about 120 degrees. So it's unfavorable to yeast fermentation. And then we can use that in our brew kettle or in our mash to adjust the pH and get some lactic profile without, in my, the little lines I've drawn in the sand for myself. I'm not, I'm creating house character, doing things with our own ingredients and creating unique beer, but we're getting our lactobacillus contribution maybe in a slightly different way than some other people.
Yeah. That kind of covered my next question too. You really got into it there, which I love. I was going to ask kind of how do you target each of these microbes? So when you're creating a spontaneous fermentation, like you were talking about, James, you've got Brett and you've got lactic acid producing bacteria. And you kind of got into how you treat for Brett and how, or what kind of temperatures and how long Brett likes to take to ferment, and then also the favorite fermentation temperatures for bacteria as well. So we'll kind of move on to my next topic, which is how do you determine if an unwanted microbe has gotten into your spontaneous fermentation?
Yeah, for us, it's purely sensory. So I think even sometimes the desired microbe can make a beer that doesn't taste good. So it's really about tasting barrels and being like, yeah, this one's not good. It doesn't really matter so much why. We sort of know and mark barrels if we give them a second chance, but if it's a barrel is consistently for some reason making beer that we're dumping, then we eventually will trash that barrel. Yes, I don't know. I think the biggest microbe that we fight that is an unwanted microbe that leaves a definite trace is Acetobacter, which is not something we want. Probably unlike kombucha, because it makes a beer sort of vinegary. I personally don't like that flavor at all. I think some people have an issue determining if something is sour, acidic sour, or acetic, meaning vinegary sour, because they're not the same thing. And I try to make beer that has very low to no acetic present, and that's made predominantly, I believe, by Acetobacter, which needs oxygen. So usually it's a sign that barrel maybe fermented too vigorously first and then has too much headspace and wasn't topped up in time, or maybe it's got, I don't know, some kind of ingress in alcohol. We're pretty good at minimizing it, but that is probably the number one thing that makes us dump beer, I would say. That and combinations of compounds that can come from that. Because once you have that, Brett can take that acetic acid and make some even crazier compounds that you also want.
Yeah.
And that's, I was getting kind of cut out a little bit for hearing everything that you were saying, James, but it's similar. I think I was kind of getting, it's, for us, I don't know necessarily if there's anything that is indicative that something foreign has gotten into, our brews necessarily, like any wild yeast or anything that's kind of in the air. But ours is just, if there's something going on with our brewing, it usually has to do with, you know, if there was too much sugar or maybe not a strong enough tea, or the temperature was off, or it was a little too high or a little too low. And so if we can't correct it, then we'll have to get rid of the brew as well. But luckily we haven't. Usually everything's pretty easy to correct with at least kombucha. It's pretty forgiving, where we're able to add a little bit more stronger tea and kind of recorrect it and let it go for a little bit longer. So
Melinda, is that tea, when you say that there may be too much tea, do you notice if you add too much tea, does it affect your fermentation?
Well, we really have never had a problem with it. Too much tea, it might be that we didn't steep a certain, like when we've tried a new kind of like black tea, maybe we didn't steep it as long. So it just has kind of a weak flavor, kind of watered down. And so we might add, and that could even be an indication, you know, that the yeast or the bacteria are, I'm sorry, my computer, I need to plug it in. So anyways, so yeah, we just, that's kind of, that's the case more than not, is if we're kind of experimenting and we need to make it ferment for a little bit, or steep it for a little bit longer.
One of the, you know, I totally agree with James as far as like the biggest evil, I should say, the thing that we're battling all the time is acetic production. And that's a challenge when you're trying to do things naturally and wild and open in wood. And so my learning curve was fairly quick with that, because, you know, before, when I was starting my project, I knew even less than I do now. And a lot of my information was coming from, you know, the Belgian lambic producers. And there is it's a lot more humid in Belgium than it is in the high desert of Central Oregon. But, you know, so at first I was trying to rely on the pellicle formation, you know, like, so in barrel aging with wild cultures, the wild yeast can form what's called a pellicle, like a little film over the top of the beer in the barrel, which can protect it from acetobacter and acetic acid production. And initially that was my thought. It's like, well, if the Belgians do it this way, then that's how I'm going to do it too. But realized pretty quickly that here, with the very dry environment we're in, we see a lot of ullage in our barrels, you know, and it gets to the point where if we don't address it, you know, we can actually have the staves shrink far enough where you could probably look in there and see the beer. And so I started topping barrels fairly early on, which years ago was it was kind of like the hot side aeration discussion. It's like, oh, do you top or do you not top? And oh my gosh, can you believe he tops? Or, oh, I can't believe they don't top. You know, it was a big deal. It came up in conversations, but what I really liked and learned about that was I was listening to the environment around me, and doing something to create beer that I found palatable, I like to drink. It was good for my process, and the fact that we introduce fresh beer 3, 4, 5 times a year sometimes, it's unique to us in this place, and it helps us create the beer we do. But just like, and again, like James was saying, pulling nails, tasting barrels, acetic is the first thing that I'm really looking for. It's like, it all, you know, especially in some of these beers that you've been excited about, you pull a nail and you're like, oh my God, please just don't have too much acetic character. That's kind of the first thing. Although I will say a tiny little bit of acetic, you know, I have found for us helps pop certain other flavors. It really does help act as a little platform to push some things through. So I'm not completely anti. We have had some beers that definitely had too much acetic in it, but a little tiny bit has helped us develop our flavor profile. But then again, there's other things, like we this one year we did a couple barrels with fresh strawberries that came in. We processed them at the exact same time, exactly the same way, and one barrel was great strawberry character, and the other one had those phenols that our strawberries are notorious for, and we had to dump that barrel. But I think working with barrels, that is a whole another wild card to go with this wild ale discussion. It's like you can put the same beer into two different barrels, and one might turn out great and the other one might not. And if you're not paying attention to that and making sure you're culling the bad barrels, you're going to be in a situation. We've got, I think we've got about 150, 175 barrels in our barrel cellar. And I would say that I've got about 6 that I'm still using from my first days in 2011 because they keep turning out good beer, and we love those barrels very much.
We call those unicorn barrels.
Nice. I like that.
So yeah, I guess we'll jump into some foraging questions because I think that's a really exciting topic. What are some ways that you guys process your whole foraged fruit? Are there any quality assurance checkpoints you guys go through when using wild fruits and during conditioning?
We don't forage fruit. We're up in the woods, so the things that we're foraging for, we forage flowers. I guess the blackcurrant would be considered a fruit. We forage blackcurrant. We forage, different plants like trees and the leaves of certain other plants. And really, what we found for our tree beers is we wait for the spring growth, like when people talk about making spruce tip beers. But we generally will harvest a little ways back to get a little bit of the woody stem because we get a little resin in there and it kind of rounds it out. And regarding the blackcurrant, it's really we just have to pay attention to when the berries are ripe and do our best to not include things that aren't those berries.
Oh yeah, that's similar. We go out, we do a lot of berries, and we typically process them. We'll either freeze them right away for use later, but a lot of times when we're adding them, we'll kind of cook them down and just kind of release those flavors before adding them directly into the brew. And so we also go out and get flowers and different plant parts. And I found that when I dry them, so we'll dry them ourselves on racks outside, and that they give a lot better flavor than some of the fresh ones. Although I do love using fresh, I just don't get the flavor profile. And sometimes kombucha can be so strong, it just overpowers. So I go out and collect lilacs, and I just can't get the lilac flavor to kind of pop if they're fresh. And so it's kind of like trial and error every year as we get different things to see what kind of works and what doesn't. But that's kind of the way that we do things here.
We tried our first lilac beer this year, and we did not dry it, and it came out good, but I think next year we will have to try drying our lilac first. Yeah,
try it out. I feel like the lilac would have popped if I would have had maybe like a lot more, like tons and tons more. So we only our largest batch per flavor, we usually do about 55 to 70 gallons per flavor. So we do like around 100 flavors a year, and so we're sometimes our batches are as little as 15 gallons depending on how much we can get. And we got quite a bit of lilacs last year, but I just can't get it to pop. So anyways, yeah, try dried.
Thank you.
James,
yeah, we've done a couple of little things with foraging, but honestly it's difficult to get quantity of fruit, honestly, that to make. I mean, people think like, oh, you harvested, you foraged a bucket of wild brambles or something. That doesn't go very far at all in making it. So it becomes pretty difficult. We mostly focus on knowing local farmers, which are not even really local. Most of the stuff is on the western slope of Colorado, so it's about 2.5, 3 hours away. There's some stuff on the fruit range, but the classical fruit growing region in Colorado, if there is one, is on the western slope. It's a little bit more, I don't know, it's actually kind of high desert, but for some reason it's a place where they grow, and it's a little bit, maybe more like, I don't know where it's like, but there's a lot of good stone fruit around there, and there's people experimenting. And there's a lot of wine grapes grown there too, and we can get most of our fruits from there for vine fruit.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we do ends up being going directly into a barrel. Because it becomes quickly almost impossible to gather enough stuff for an entire batch. You know, I mean, fortunately, like these little blackcurrant that we use, it's there's a lot of power to the punch. You know, I mean, we only harvest about 5 pounds of it, but it's really intense, and so it actually adds a decent enough contribution where it feels like it's worthwhile. You know.
Totally.
Yeah, I agree.
We recently did a barrel aged blend, and we're conditioning it on blueberries, and we needed 600 pounds. Which, if you've ever picked blueberries,
yeah,
a lot of berries. Our whole team out there, and we thought we would get at least 300 pounds with 6 to 7 people, and we think we came back with a little under 100. So,
oh yeah.
Well, you tried. You know, you tried. That's good.
Yeah. So you mentioned putting fruit on wood, Paul. Have you guys noticed a difference in conditioning your fruit on wood versus in steel? Is there a certain time length that you condition your fruit on the beer? Any insights to that?
I mean, it's really, it's so dependent upon the brewer and what they're trying to do. You know, I mean, I guess a lot of our methods sometimes aren't necessarily just about paying attention to 174 different barrels and being on top of it at exactly the right time is also something that I am not professing I am a master of. And so some of our fruit projects, you know, like we intentionally put the fruit on there for very long term. We've bottle conditioned with fruit juices. We've tried short-term fruit, you know, doing the fermentation based off the skins on the fruit. And each one is something that we can learn from. But it's really like, oh my gosh, for most of the time, what it's like is, oh my gosh, this fruit's ready. What can we do with it? As opposed to saying, you know, writing up the perfect scenario and being able to execute that. You know, I mean, there's a lot of talk about people not wanting, you know, fruit projects that go into the bottle and wanting those bottles consumed fairly soon because that fruit flavor might die off, similar to like maybe the spirit character if you age in a spirit barrel. But, you know, for me, it's like those fruit components that are in there, yeah, they're going to taste one way fresh, but they're going to change and it turn into something else when you age it. And so I'm not one of those that I'm never trying to put in enough fruit where it's like it dominates everything. I want it to kind of be balanced with, you know, the ester profile and almost a little bit of confusion. Is like, is that fruit characteristic coming from actual fruit or is it part of the fermentation or something along those lines? So yeah, a little bit of a jumble of information there for you.
All right. Anybody else have anything to say about that?
I mean, we kind of do it 2 different. I mean, obviously, there's only 2 really different ways to do it as far as steel or wood in question. We do it both ways. It depends a lot on what we're doing. If it's whole fruit, it's much more often done in wood. So we just got I don't know, many 100 pounds of Balaton cherries, and we make a cherry beer that's made with 1, 2, and 3-year-old spontaneous beer every year. And essentially that beer sits on whole cherries for almost a whole year. We basically emptied that. It's in a foeder. It's in wood. Actually, I guess answers the question. And we emptied out, and literally within about a week, the new cherries are ready. We're actually determining when we're making beer based on when the new harvest is coming of the cherries. So if for some reason cherries are 3 weeks later the next year, then we're gonna bottle that 3 weeks later, and then it sits in bottle for 5 or 6 months. In most cases, but yeah, we do that in wood. Now our canned beers, those are made from Calera style blends, and those we make those with whole fruit puree from Oregon Fruit Products, and those are done in steel. It's a little bit just about time and also about volume when it comes to that. We're blending from 17 and 20 barrel tanks instead of from 60-gallon barrels. So in that case, we use puree. Also because we want to be able to make those fruit beers for the cans all year round, and we don't have access to pomegranates or pineapples in Colorado at all, and certainly it's a seasonal product anyway. So we use puree for that.
Yeah, so we're about halfway through, so we're going to give a quick shout out to BSG because they are one of our sponsors. So just give them a little whoop whoop kind of thing. Raise the roof on BSG.
Yeah.
So do you guys ever do second use on your fruit skins? And if so, do you ever have any differences in flavors or aroma? Is there a drastic difference there for you guys?
Will you repeat the question? I missed the first part of that.
Yeah. So, do you guys ever do second use fruit? So second batch of beer in on same thing of fruit?
Yeah, definitely. We've found that to be a really good use of AR investment, but also we've been producing some lower alcohol, much lighter, sensitive beers. Like this Goza that Connor's come up with, and it's responded really, really well to second use fruit. Especially if we get a beer that's coming out off the fruit and it tastes really good. I mean, to be able to just go right back into the barrel and take advantage of that is something that we've enjoyed a lot. Yeah, we've made that a big part of our program.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, we use second use fruit quite a bit. Pretty much anytime we've used whole fruit, we try to make some amount of second use fruit beer out of it. Not necessarily using all of it, but sometimes we'll just do one for draft when that was a thing in the before times. But I think it's great because it's interesting. There's a difference between using second use fruit and just using fruit, right? So a second use raspberry doesn't just taste like a less raspberry. Some flavor, some part of that flavor is still 100%. And then some part is zero. So it's just a different, to me, it's just a different character than if you had just used less. So it's also definitely economical and why not? It makes really interesting, usually very delicate beers with this sort of second use. It can put a different twist on what a raspberry or a pear or whatever it is can taste like, because you lose. First of all, it's always fermented slowly. So you're not starting with the sugar, so you're not adding that to it. And some of those compounds have blown off or were captured within the first beer, and so you get a really different fruit interpretation. Yes, it's pretty cool.
That's interesting, and that's not something that I've ever done before. So I might have to give that a try, especially when I have an abundance of something like. Well, we do small batches, like I said, so we get a lot of blueberries. But like blueberries or even peaches, that's something it seems like we always just have a ton. So that's a good idea. I'm gonna have to try that.
All right, and then kind of the final serious question here for you guys. When starting a fermentation or a spontaneous fermentation beer, do you already have kind of a special project for it in mind, or as it ages, are you tasting it and kind of figuring out what you think would taste good with it as far as adjuncts and foraged fruits or anything else like that?
I can start, I guess. For us, we have a few times made beers. I'll say, made work specifically, knowing what was going to happen to it. But in general, I mean, I consider us a blendery. That name wasn't quite as cool, or it wasn't really a thing when we started. But that blending is really, really important for us because every barrel tastes differently, even though they're all almost the same recipe. So I would say no. In general, we make 3 or 4 different recipes in the brew house, and those go in. We have a 100% wheat recipe. We have a sour golden recipe, and we have different variations, but essentially the same sort of traditional method lambic recipe. And we brew those, and then when those beers are ready, we take those ideas. So if we have an idea to use mint or pomegranate or whatever, we're taking that concept and then looking for beers that in blending to suit that idea, or maybe making a blend and be like, oh, you know what this would be good with X herb or fruit, adding to the blend. But it's very rare that we go into the brew house and say, today we're brewing this beer that's going to have this fruit later and this stuff later. It's just, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just not how we. Part of it is because the timeline is so vast from when we brewed to when we're making beer that we sort of, our idea is sort of to have this inventory of blendable beer and then make our beers from that. So the brewing is in some ways very disconnected from the actual production of the beer, if that makes sense.
We're kind of similar. I mean, even though it seems like kombucha is very simplistic, you know, the same batch that's using the exact same ingredients, depending on, you know, if the temperature varies just by a few degrees, it can really taste different once it's kind of ready to go into that secondary ferment. And so it sometimes just takes some tasting to kind of say like, oh yeah, I think that this would really pair well because it's so delicate. Like this batch just has such a delicate flavor. It might pair well with, you know, something that's a little bit more delicate like lilacs or some kind of floral blend where it's not going to be dominated. The kombucha itself, the taste won't dominate the flavor profile of the flowers and things like that. And so that's probably the closest that I can answer that question, or, you know, just by going kind of tasting right before it goes into the secondary ferment to kind of determine what we should blend it with. I would, like all of our black tea kombucha primary ferments would go for really robust flavors like pineapple or even cherry or something like that, because they're not going to be overshadowed because the flavors are so strong. So, and then I'd save my green tea or a green tea black tea blend for something else. So, yeah.
Yeah. So one of my original goals was to avoid blending, mainly in the way that, and that's not to say that we don't do it, but if for our beers that we you know, we have recipes for each one. You know, I've got a bunch of brands, and they each have a recipe that includes the barrel that they're going to go into, and all this stuff is done up front, right? So the way my brewery works is the brewer's involved pretty intimately at the beginning of the process. You know, we're determining, you know, different malts to use and how we use the hops and which barrels and kind of the way that the primary fermentation goes and then to the aging barrel. That's all something that we're pretty involved in, even in the spontaneous beers. But once they get in the barrel, it's my hope that it will go their own way, right? That they do take on the identity of the barrel, that they do represent, say, like a little snapshot in time. And if the beer merits, if it's good enough, right, which fortunately for us, it happens often enough where we can stamp our bottles and say, you know, this was a single barrel of beer that went through our entire process that we didn't blend, you know. And it's like the idea of like a single varietal wine or a single malt scotch that encapsulates something for me that's really important. It's like this little time capsule. And it's also very important for me because of this idea of creating natural beer, that I remove myself from the final decision on how this beer is going to taste. Although, you know, because everything comes out of barrels differently, we do the blending as well. And maybe that's a confidence thing as well. I'm just, I I prefer kind of like when I travel, like not necessarily to have an itinerary, you know, and it's like when you end up in those one places that you hear about, you know, it's like oh my gosh, we would have never been here if we would have planned our whole trip out. But of course, you can also end up at the other places, you know, that aren't so great. But that in my dream world, that's kind of how we move our beer through here. It's like I'm involved, Connor's involved up front, and then once we get the beer into the barrels, we're really watching to see where they go, and hopefully at the end we can just be like, this is awesome, look what happens, you know. And so I guess to finish that, it's just like that we'll determine the fruit and the adjuncts based on barrel tasting way late in the process.
Okay. All right. Well, it is about time for question and answer. So we're going to see how kind the public is going to be to you. First question is from Melinda. During the process of making kombucha, does it ever become alcoholic? Is there a possibility for alcoholic kombucha in the future?
So we keep our alcohol below. We're trying to not produce an alcoholic kombucha. But yeah, that's definitely something that I'm interested in possibly pursuing in the future. So I'm kind of excited, but right now we try to take every precaution to keep our alcohol content as low as possible, because if we get above the 0.5%, then we'd have to have an alcohol license. And so we're just trying to avoid that for now.
All right. Next question is, what is Rachel drinking? That's me. I am drinking the Rhythm Blue Light Lager. We actually brewed this one here in-house for Rhythm Brewing Company. It's their recipe, but we really wanted to include it in the box. So we were able to brew it for them and throw it in there. So if you guys still have it in your box, you should start drinking it now. All right, next question. Has anyone on this panel made a spruce beer? Did you forage for the spruce tips?
We do. We make a spruce beer a few times a year. And yeah, we have spruce that grows right outside the brewery. So the answer is yes and yes. And in the early days, we actually cut one of these big old spruce trees down and hollowed it out and made a Norwegian Kerna out of it and made our spruce beer in a very interesting way. It was a lot of fun. But like I was saying before, we get the tips, but we also get a little bit of the previous year's growth. So we get a little bit of the resin as well as those oils that are in the tips.
I have not, but I definitely want to visit with you more about that, because I wanted to do spruce tip kombucha for a long time. So yeah.
Yeah, we haven't done it. I'm interested in trying it, but we've never actually just gone through and done it. So.
All right. Next question. They're trying to find one for us. So I have a question for you guys. Can you guys talk about your favorite spontaneous ale that you've ever made? Any adjuncts in it? What was it like?
Sure. I think my favorite one that we've ever made, we do it every year, called Tag Board. And it is essentially a 3-year blend of spontaneous beer. And right before it is bottled, it's almost like fruiting it. We use wet hops that are locally grown, and they're Neo-Mexicanas hops, which are actually the hops that are native to Colorado. They're domesticated, though. It's not foraged, but a local farmer, Voss Farms, does it for us. And we bought pretty much their whole harvest of Neo 1 Neo-Mexicanas hop. And we put those in wet into a barrel and then add the beer on top and rest for a few weeks. And the point of it is sort of biotransformation thing where this beer, the first time we did it, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, and it still tastes incredibly hoppy. And I think it's a testament to the true wild microbes and how they can protect and transform compounds and protect a beer from oxygen degradation. Nobody talks about being excited about getting a 25-year-old IPA, but 25-year-old Lambic is an absolute treat. Sometimes falls off. It's usually pretty good.
My favorites probably we go out and this year we were able to collect some gooseberries, so they're just local. It's not something we've been able to get every year, so the last time was like maybe 3 years ago we had a gooseberry kombucha, but that's probably one of my favorites, and we just launched that this week and it's sold out in like a day. So it's gone now until next year, but it's one of those things where we just, we were only able to get a couple quarts of it, so you just got to make do with what you can actually go get when you're foraging. So it was really good.
My favorite is one that we haven't finished yet, but it was a morning that we was going out to make some spontaneous beer, not our mixed wild ferments, but a true spontaneous beer. And our brewery is surrounded by spruce trees and fir trees, and we use both spruce and fir in certain of our beers. And I was standing outside. There was a little spot of sun, so I was standing there in the sun. I was hearing this noise. It was just like, what the heck is that? And fir trees, they when they develop their cones, they're way at the top, and they're I've often wondered how I could make beer with these fir cones, because they're really, they're tight, and they're full of a lot of resin and pitch and sap. And so as I was standing there, I noticed that there was this squirrel that was dropping these cones. And I was like, man, wouldn't that be cool if he dropped enough for me to make beer with? And they kept coming down. I filled 2 5-gallon buckets with these beautiful green fir cones that really, they're like 60 to 80 feet off the ground. There's no way I could get them. So this is my squirrel collab. He didn't seem to be too upset. I didn't get attacked or anything, but I basically broke those things up and put them in the cool ship to get that sap and the resin to get into the beer. And we've tasted in the barrel, and it's tasting really good. And I don't know. With collaborations being such a thing, I don't know if anybody's collaborated with a squirrel before.
Oh my God. All right. Next question is from Mike Bush. He wants to know if any of you have ever had any trouble with cross-contamination between your spontaneous and your traditional brews.
We don't do any traditional brews.
I would generally say we don't either, but we have a couple of times. So we did like a pro-am, almost kind of like for fun, because very much not what we do. We did a GABF pro-am. We did I think it was just I think it was a Czech, but it was a Pilsner, just like straight traditional. Beer was like really good, and like I'm very happy with it. It was great. There were no issues. We've also done a couple what we call our super stouts that are 20% plus alcohol, imperial stouts. We haven't had any problem with cross-contamination with those either.
The pills didn't get cross-contaminated. Is that what you said?
No, it didn't. It was great. It was
rad.
It was just classic Pilsner. We have a plate chiller that we use for some special projects. So we just clean the hell out of that and sort of like double CIP cycle a tank. And I wouldn't want to do something. I wouldn't want to like have a clean brewery as part of this because it's a lot of extra work. And it's just not really what we do. But occasionally we've done it, and I think it worked okay. So.
All right, we are going to end on this next question. They're looking for advice for a home brewer looking to start with wild or spontaneous fermentation. Do you guys have any advice for him?
One thing that I've found that seems to work pretty good is to start with some wort that you make the wort, get in the carboy, and find some fruit, and put the fruit in there, and let that start. Let that fermentation start. And if you like it, when you rack the beer out of there, just put some more wort in there. And it's a real easy way to kind of dip your toe into this, and you know, and it's just you gotta pay attention to what's going on and taste it. And if you don't like it, either try a different piece of fruit or leave it out in another different place. But you just gotta start trying things, and if you like it, make sure you reserve that yeast at the bottom of your carboy and use it again.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome idea. I did talk about this at one point, the Homebrewers Conference. You can probably find the PowerPoint or the YouTube of that. I don't know, but I think as far as trying to make traditional, you know, lambic at home, I think it's very difficult because to me, it's the cooling rate of that work is very important, and it's very, very difficult to get a proper cooling rate in a 5-gallon line. So I've seen many people that they're like, "Oh, I'm a home brewer. I just spent $1,000 that to build up this very tiny cool ship, and it's like 2.5 inches deep." And first of all, I'm like, wow, that's a lot of money to make it like what you could probably find in a restaurant store. But secondly, you know, it's a surface area to volume thing. So just because it has what looks like the same geometry as our cool ship at Black Project or Pantheon's cool ship, if it's only 5 gallons, that's going to cool really, really fast. And I know I tried it when I was home brewing, just leaving my like 6-gallon boil kettle out overnight in the wintertime. It was cool, you know, like before I went to bed. I mean, and a big part to me of spontaneous brewing is the bacterial growth that happens in the so-called danger zone, where you don't want to store food, but you need your cool ship to be going through that temperature range. And it's difficult to do that on a homebrew level because of the physics of a small batch. I know some people that, you know, they have an electric kettle and they've actually done like some kind of programming stuff with the, you know, microcontroller to actually use the heater and let it cool down over about 12 hours. So they programmed in a curve. Someone told me they did that, and that was the good result. But it's very difficult to get it going properly if you want it to be traditional lambic style on a 5-gallon or even 10-gallon batch, in my view, and from what I've heard from people. So.
All right, well, I think that is all we have time for today. We really appreciate you guys coming on and talking to us about what I think is the most fun thing about brewing. But I think everyone has their own opinions. But we really appreciate it. I had a blast. I hope you guys did too.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Oh, good. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye, guys.